A world split asunder, the unheeded warnings of 1945, a year etched in our collective memory as the end of a global conflict, a triumph over tyranny. Yet, as the shadow of Nazi Germany receded, another darkness began to spread. The Soviet Union, its power solidified, tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, ushering in an era of communist rule that would claim tens of millions of lives. The world, celebrating victory, failed to heed the warning signs, overlooking the brutal reality of communist ideology in action. The defeat of Nazi Germany should have marked a decisive victory for freedom and human rights. Instead, it became a tale of two outcomes: liberation for some, and the cruel embrace of totalitarian rule for others. While the West rebuilt and embraced democratic principles, the Soviet Union expanded its empire, imposing its will on nations trapped behind what Winston Churchill aptly termed the Iron Curtain. This division marked the beginning of the Cold War, a global standoff fueled by the stark contrast between individual liberty and communist oppression. The horrors of Nazism, forever seared into our collective conscience, became a focal point for understanding the depths of human cruelty. The Holocaust, a systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and state-sponsored violence. Yet, the atrocities committed under communist regimes, often on an even greater scale, have largely faded from public memory. This essay seeks to shed light on the forgotten lessons of 1945, to remind the world of the human cost of communism. From the Gulags of the Soviet Union to the killing fields of Cambodia, the 20th century bore witness to the devastating consequences of communist ideology. By examining these historical tragedies, we can better understand the dangers of totalitarian regimes and the enduring importance of safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. The iron grip of Soviet terror from Gulags to the Holodomor. The Soviet Union, under the iron rule of Joseph Stalin, provides a chilling example of communism's human toll. The Gulag system, a vast network of forced labor camps, became synonymous with state-sponsored terror. Millions of Soviet citizens deemed enemies of the state were imprisoned under inhumane conditions, subjected to torture, starvation, and often death. The Gulags were not simply places of punishment, they were instruments of social control, designed to eliminate dissent and maintain the Communist Party's grip on power. One of the most horrific examples of Soviet brutality was the Holodomor, a man-made famine that ravaged Ukraine in the 1930s. Driven by Stalin's ruthless collectivization policies, which aimed to eliminate private land ownership and force farmers onto collective farms, the Holodomor resulted in the deaths of millions of Ukrainians, grain seizures, enforced quotas, and the suppression of any resistance created a catastrophic food shortage, turning one of Europe's breadbaskets into a land of starvation and death. The Holodomor was not an unfortunate byproduct of misguided policies. It was a deliberate act of genocide, designed to crush Ukrainian nationalism and break the peasantry's resistance to collectivization. The Soviet regime's systematic denial of the famine, its efforts to conceal the true death toll, and its continued persecution of Ukrainian intellectuals and cultural figures underscore the calculated cruelty of Stalin's regime. The Soviet Union's legacy is one of repression, mass murder, and the suppression of basic human rights. The Gulags, the Holodomor, and countless other acts of state-sponsored terror serve as stark reminders of the human cost of communist ideology. The Soviet experiment, far from creating a workers' paradise, descended into a nightmare of totalitarian control, where individual lives were sacrificed at the altar of a flawed and deadly ideology. Mao's China, a revolution consumed by its own fury. Across the vast expanse of Asia, another communist regime rose to power, leaving an equally devastating mark on history. Mao Zedong's China, born out of a revolution that promised equality and prosperity, quickly descended into a maelstrom of violence and repression. The Great Leap Forward, Mao's ambitious plan to rapidly transform China into an industrial powerhouse, resulted in one of the deadliest famines in human history. Driven by ideological fervor and a disregard for human life, the Great Leap Forward's disastrous policies led to widespread starvation, claiming the lives of tens of millions of Chinese citizens. Forced collectivization, grain seizures, and the implementation of unworkable agricultural techniques created a perfect storm of famine and despair. The Chinese Communist Party's suppression of information and its refusal to acknowledge the scale of the disaster exacerbated the suffering, turning a man-made catastrophe into a national tragedy. As the Great Leap Forward faltered, Mao unleashed another wave of terror on China, the Cultural Revolution. Fueled by a paranoid fear of internal enemies and a desire to reassert his absolute authority, Mao mobilized China's youth, the Red Guards, to purge the country of capitalist raiders and counter-revolutionaries. Schools were closed, intellectuals were persecuted, and ancient cultural artifacts were destroyed in a frenzy of violence and chaos. The Cultural Revolution left China's social fabric in tatters, its economy in ruins, and its people traumatized by years of fear and violence. The legacy of Mao's reign continues to cast a long shadow over China, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the human cost of revolutionary zeal. The Chinese Communist Party's attempts to rewrite history and downplay the horrors of this period only serve to underscore the importance of remembering these atrocities and learning from the mistakes of the past. Section 4. The Killing Fields: Cambodia's Descent into Darkness. The horrors of communism were not confined to the Soviet Union or China. In the Southeast Asian nation of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, led by the brutal dictator Pol Pot, unleashed a reign of terror that ranks among the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. Driven by a twisted vision of agrarian utopia, the Khmer Rouge sought to transform Cambodia into a classless society, purging the country of anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution. Upon seizing power in 1975, the Khmer Rouge emptied the cities, forcing millions of Cambodians into rural labor camps. Intellectuals, professionals, anyone deemed a threat to the regime's ideology were targeted for elimination. The killing fields, mass graves scattered across the Cambodian countryside, stand as chilling testament to the regime's brutality. Under the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia became a giant prison camp where starvation, disease, and overwork were rampant. The regime's systematic torture and execution of anyone suspected of disloyalty created an atmosphere of constant fear and paranoia. Children were torn from their families, indoctrinated into the regime's ideology, and often forced to participate in acts of violence. The Cambodian genocide, a horrific chapter in human history, serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the dehumanizing nature of totalitarian ideologies. The Khmer Rouge's attempt to create a utopian society through violence and repression resulted in the deaths of an estimated 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the country's population. The scars of this genocide continue to haunt Cambodia, a somber reminder of the human cost of ideological extremism. Section 5. Castro's Cuba, a Caribbean island under surveillance. The allure of communist revolution extended beyond the major powers, captivating revolutionaries and intellectuals alike. In the Caribbean, Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba in 1959 promised a new era of social justice and economic equality. However, the Cuban Revolution, initially welcomed by many, soon revealed its own brand of repression and authoritarianism. Castro's Cuba, despite its promises of social equality, quickly descended into a one-party state, suppressing dissent and curtailing individual freedoms. The Castro regime imprisoned political opponents, silenced critics, and imposed strict controls on freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. The dream of a more just and equitable society gave way to the reality of a police state where fear and surveillance permeated everyday life. The Cuban government's tight grip on the economy stifled innovation and entrepreneurship, leading to chronic shortages and economic stagnation. The regime's reliance on Soviet aid created a dangerous dependency, leaving Cuba vulnerable to the whims of its communist benefactor. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 plunged Cuba into an economic crisis, highlighting the inherent flaws of its centrally planned economy. Despite its initial promises, the Cuban Revolution ultimately failed to deliver on its promises of prosperity and freedom. The Castro regime's legacy is one of political repression, economic stagnation, and the suppression of basic human rights. The Cuban experience serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating how revolutionary ideals can be twisted to serve the interests of an authoritarian regime. As we reflect on the horrors of communism, it becomes evident that the lessons of the 20th century have not been fully absorbed. The atrocities committed under communist regimes serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism. Yet, in today's world, we see echoes of these same mistakes. From modern-day North Korea's oppressive regime to the continued political repression in places like Venezuela, the shadow of communism's past continues to loom over parts of our world. The promises of utopia, when enforced through totalitarian means, inevitably lead to suffering and despair. It is essential to remember the stories of those who lived through these dark times, to honor the memory of those who lost their lives, and to learn from their experiences. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not the end of the struggle against tyranny and oppression. It was a chapter in an ongoing narrative that demands our attention. To move forward as a society, we must learn from the past and ensure that such horrors are never repeated. Education and awareness are our strongest tools against the repetition of history's darkest chapters. We must cultivate a commitment to human rights, uphold democratic values, and remain vigilant against the allure of authoritarianism. The final lesson of the 20th century is clear. Vigilance, education, and a commitment to human rights are essential to prevent history from repeating itself. Let us honor the past by building a future where freedom, justice, and human dignity are upheld for all. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others. Together, we can ensure that the lessons of history are never forgotten. By engaging in conversations and educating ourselves and others, we can build a more informed and compassionate society. Let us strive to be the guardians of history, ensuring that the sacrifices of the past lead to a brighter future for all.